Hey everyone, we're grateful for your support and hope our podcast has been helpful in both your personal and professional journey. We've added new continuing education webinars to our website. And as you renew your license, head over and check out our available courses. We'll be adding even more in the future, so stay tuned. And now, without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. The gender binary, this idea that there are only two genders, male and female. It simply doesn't reflect the rich tapestry of human experiences, and especially for queer people of color. For queer people of color, who often navigate multiple marginalized identities, how might we expand beyond the restrictive binary system? And what are essential ways to create a space where clients can explore their gender identities outside of westernized colonial views of sexuality? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Sen. As part of our Pride Month series, our guest today is Dr. Nadia Alsamadi, a queer and non-binary bicultural Palestinian American person working as a licensed clinical psychologist and educator in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Dr. Alsamadi's clinical work focuses on collaborating with LGBTQ+, Middle Eastern and North African or Southwest Asian and North African, and first or second generation immigrant clients to explore issues related to identity, culture, oppression, and empowerment. She has also taught 10+ psychology courses, and her work in education and mentorship similarly addresses students, trainee, and peer development of critical consciousness and cultural humility. Dr. Alsamadi was the recipient of the Doctoral Medal for Excellence in Psychology from Loyola University in Maryland, the 30 Under 30 Award from the Arab American Foundation, the Student Excellence in Teaching and Mentorship Award from APA's Division 29, and a Distinguished Student Contribution Award from the APA Division 44 on Society for the Psychology of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity. She also received an Outstanding Academic Advisor Award at Westchester University of Pennsylvania. As a Palestinian American psychologist, Dr. Alsamadi will be discussing the limits of gender binary for people of color and how to challenge Western colonial views of the queer experience for clients of color. Dr. Alsamadi, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk with you today.
Tell me more about what you're doing in terms of your clinical work.
Absolutely. So right now I am working in private practice, and I'm also teaching as an adjunct instructor. Semester just wrapped up. And I would say that my clinical work really focuses on exploring issues of identity and whatever that means for my clients. But I would say that folks typically seek me out who identify as LGBTQ+ and or people of color. So I would say right now, the majority of my caseload consists of queer and gender diverse folks, and about half of those folks are also people of color.
By chance, are you explicitly advertising that on your website?
Yeah, so something that's really important for me, and I think visibility is a challenging thing to talk about. I think sometimes that it can feel demanded and should be an individual choice for folks depending on their positionality, safety, a lot of different things. But for me and my positionality, being really open about my identities, I think is important in my clinical work. So it's very visible on my Psychology Today profile, on the practice website. I explicitly, name my queerness, being a bicultural Palestinian American, being the child of immigrants. And I think that folks who also share those identities inherently feel like a sense of being seen, being able to talk with someone who might kind of inherently understand some of the things that they may go through. So I think it's important for me, because I do feel comfortable sharing those things, to be open about it in my advertising and then also in the therapy space as is appropriate as well.
Yeah, because it seems like, you're putting it out there, recognizing these identities that you carry, and in many ways making it available and seen for other people so they can also seek you out. And also for you to have a caseload where most of your clients are Amina. That is phenomenal.
Yeah, it's such a rewarding part of my work is to be able to connect with folks with a shared racial and ethnic background. Some of the messages that I've received, are along the lines of like, I'm surprised that I'm finding someone like you, someone who is queer, who is Arab or Swana and is open about it. And so being able to connect on that, I think inherently provides folks like just a little bit of breathing room to not have to feel like they are holding their breath a little bit in the beginning of a session, wondering like about values or maybe like acceptance of their identity and their background.
Now, you've done this work for a while and you've noticed some themes that are coming up. Tell me some of the topics that your clients are discussing and how you have been navigating this, because we're talking, in terms of Pride Month, we're talking about
Mhm.
understanding, exploring this gender binary.
Absolutely. So I think one thing that has come up throughout so many of my queer clients of color is the issue of feeling fragmented across different spaces. So feeling like different pieces of their identities are not welcome in every space. And so in one space, they can show up as queer, but maybe they are experiencing racism. And sort of on the other end, in like spaces where they are connecting with folks on their cultural identity, maybe there is some hesitation or wondering about acceptance of queer identity, and just really kind of being exhausted from moving through the world that we live in, which is informed by white supremacy and enforces this binary that splits us inherently, and not really being able to like fully embrace the wholeness of their identity. And I think like the inherent binary that we sort of exist in puts some of those limits and enforces that fragmentation.
And so, given this recognition, I'm wondering, as a cisgender heterosexual male psychologist, I'm curious, what are some skills, what are some ways that we can really foster a compassionate and caring environment, given that we ourselves, and I say we in terms of the heterosexual environment, or viewpoint, that we likely may have internalized certain subtle cues, and we don't want to enact and microaggress our clients. That's not what we want. And so, what are some things that therapists can really do to help nurture that relationship in session?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And this is actually coming up so much in the class that I have been teaching recently. And students are sort of asking the same question. It's like how we don't want to do harm, we don't want to microaggress. So, how do we co create and cultivate this space for clients to be able to like name these really difficult experiences while also not necessarily like limiting the therapeutic space to the difficult experiences and making space for joy and empowerment and humor. And I think the first step is really doing what you just did, is like acknowledging the differences, acknowledging the systems that we live within, and that we all have been socialized with all of these isms inherently. And so some things that might feel subtle and hard for us to pick up will exist and will happen, and that's just true for everyone. And that's not to excuse it, but just to say like this is a reality of us being humans and living in this world. So I think the very first step is really just having an honest conversation about differences and similarities, and how you two can create a shared language to confront those things when they do come up. And what does relational repair look like in the therapeutic setting, especially at the outset, because that can be really difficult for someone to be able to name to someone in a position of authority like a therapist or a psychologist, like, actually you just hurt me, like that stung a little bit, or that didn't land with me, or that doesn't fit for me. So I think just really being open and setting up a framework and continuously checking in, and doing self-reflection, something that I do a lot. Like I'm a slower processor. It takes me a few days to kind of reflect and process on things. So I'm a huge fan of coming back the next week and saying, I said XYZ, and I'm wondering how that may have impacted you. These are my thoughts. Like, can we have a conversation about this?
There's a bit of self-awareness that needs to happen. And I also like that you mentioned having this conversation at the get-go with your clients. If rupture happens, how do we address it? What are some common terminologies that we can use? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think another piece too is exploring with our clients, like what has their experience been in therapy before, in healthcare settings, like in folks maybe who like we may share identities with, or we may represent to them, because I think like those historical experiences too will show up in the therapy room. And if someone has had a negative experience in therapy in the past, like we want to know about it. How has that influenced like their feelings about starting therapy or continuing in therapy today? And what has been helpful? What did they feel like they were missing? How can we kind of build on what they already have and build a relationship based on that?
Mm. What else can we do to do you have other examples regarding how we go about challenging this? And maybe, we need to define this just for our listeners. We're labeling it as a Western colonial view of queer experience for clients of color. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that Western colonial view?
Yeah, I think that really just something that really undercuts this like Western view of queerness is locking it into this binary: gay, straight, like they're out of the closet, in the closet. White supremacy doesn't give us many other options, because forcing people to exist within a binary is a way to subjugate and oppress them. By not giving folks another option to have a more expansive view of the self and way of being, that's how these systems kind of remain in power and remain in place. So I think that working with clients to help identify the way that the binary shows up in our lives, and it's so consistent. It's not just with queerness and gender identity and gender expansiveness. It is pervasive and permeates our language and our ways of being. Even just thinking about, I identify a lot of times with clients like the should versus should not language, right versus wrong, good versus bad. And that just paralyzes us when we have to fit in either of those boxes, but we don't. And then that creates so much shame and guilt. So I think, like with the comment earlier about like naming our identities and figuring out a plan forward when rupture happens, like how do we call out these systems, the effect of the binary in the therapy space, in people's lives, and really kind of see how that is constricting and limiting them, and helping folks give themselves permission to create a more expansive view of themselves, of their queer identity, and just of the human experience in general.
As you're saying this, there is a strength in your message that you're advocating for your clients and yourself and your community. So how did you get into this work?
Well, how did I get into this work in general? I will say there are a couple different experiences that really stick out to me. And I would say the first one is when I was like a little kid. I can't even, time is such a strange concept. I don't even know how old I was, but I was very young. And I remember being in the bathroom of a department store with my mom and my siblings. And there was a woman who was just sobbing. She was crying. She was in obvious distress. And everyone was sort of just walking by her. She was invisible. And I remember thinking, like, can no one see this person in obvious distress? And I sort of like poked my mom and I was like, look. And she went up to her and just hugged her while she was there in her moment of grief or distress, and just was able to communicate through that interaction, like that she was seen and that someone was there and someone was with her. And I don't even think she really said anything. If so, it was a few words. But the pause to witness someone and like provide comfort like has stuck with me throughout my entire life and has really influenced me wanting to come into this field and be able to like hold space and witness people in that way.
So much love that your mom has to be able to stop listen to your request and also meet the need of that woman that was needing help.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because she went back as a second career to be a therapist and is currently a counselor in private practice as well. So I got to see her like take that like inherent like human strength that she had just like in being a person in this world and then get to put it to work professionally and get to be there for folks kind of in the same way that I hope to do now.
Oh, that's quite amazing. Part of the helping profession to give yourself to others and then seeing that modeled by your parents, particularly in working with SWANA and queer population. How did you lean into that space?
Yeah. So there I had a really special moment during my graduate training when I was, working as a therapist in training. And I just never really saw Swana folks, Arabs like in the field. That really didn't happen until I just got an email kind of like forwarded into my inbox about AMINASI, the American Arab Middle Eastern North African Psychological Association, in my inbox. And I was like, wow, like I cannot believe this exists or this is being started. Like, and I was so excited to join. And I got a mentor who ended up being Palestinian and like, who I still talk to several years later and who was really integral in my professional and personal development. So that was a really, really huge moment for me to not really see any SWANA person in the field doing this work. That was extremely meaningful. And almost around the same time, I just happened to like get assigned to my caseload the first SWANA queer client that I have ever met. And it was like such a powerful experience because we both sort of didn't expect to see each other there. And I remember kind of leaving that first session just like speechless but also so like warm and so full. And I was like, wow, like I even right now I'm like I'm having an emotional reaction because I just felt like the two of us were very seen by each other. And I think so much of the healing is done in the relationship. And um, that clinical experience really just propelled me forward. And I was like, this is the type of work I want to do. I need to be open about myself. So that opens up the space for others who might not have the space in their life to be as open as I can be to connect. And so we can have that experience together. And so those things were, I think, really, really important for me in my professional and personal development.
Yeah. It's both somewhat sad too, right? Going into this expecting you're never going to see a queer SWANA client. And for your client to think the other way, I'm probably never going to see a queer SWANA therapist. But then to finally connect, find each other. And that's, yes, there's a bit of sadness. On the other hand, there's this feeling of hope.
Yes, absolutely. I think hope is so like critical to anything we do. Like there are obviously moments where like that hope can feel diminished, where there is despair, where there is sadness. And then having moments like that, being able to remember moments like that and being able to like cultivate hope for the future, I think is a really important part of relational healing and doing therapy. And it really relates to, I think, I love the psychology of radical healing framework by Hector Adames and colleagues and the Radical Healing Collective. Their framework for working with people of color, and I think it can really be applied like seamlessly into working with queer folks of color as well, to like identify the structural oppression and harm that is done to folks and be able to develop strength and resistance and knowledge of oneself and also like radical hope for a different future and for a different present for us as well, has been like really integral in informing like the work that I do.
Mhm. And as we're exploring this idea of the oppressive systems, can you share with us in your career as a person of color, what were some of those challenges that you faced and overcame that you would be willing to share?
Yeah. I think one of the things which you already kind of touched on was like the erasure and invisibility of SWANA folks in the field, but also as like potential clients. There was really no like training addressing work with Arabs, North Africans, SWANA folks at all. And I think that that's a challenge, absolutely, because you will interact with us in your life and in your clinical work. So I think that was a challenge. But I think also like just for me, like navigating bicultural identity development and coming from a bicultural like household, trying to figure out like where do I fit in the field, in community, because it's really important for me to like identify, like I was saying earlier, my positionality and like my racialized experience as someone who is often assumed to be white, and my proximity to whiteness affords me so much safety because I benefit from white privilege, and I benefit from systems of oppression in that way. And I have a very different experience from like white Americans as well. So I think trying to hold the space for like understanding and recognizing the internalized white supremacy that I hold, while also saying like I do have a racialized experience here in the US, and that how do we like talk about that as well, like in this conversation of living in the United States, a place that was built and founded on the subjugation and exploitation and genocide of Black and Indigenous folks, and that needs to be front and center. And also understanding the experience of SWANA and Arab folks and folks with bicultural identity and biracial identity as well.
So, Dr. Alsamadi, you mentioned you are bicultural and biracial, and you are white passing. So, how are you navigating the bicultural and biracial identity?
Yeah, I think it's something, where I have to do my own work in terms of anti-racism and acknowledging and understanding and calling out my own implicit biases and the ways that like internalized white supremacy show up in my life and my clinical work and my professional work. And I think a big piece of that is naming that in session with clients. So like folks will reach out to me at, I have my photo and my identities listed, but really making sure that like when we're talking about racialized experiences, that we can have a conversation about the nuances and the differences, although we may both identify as racial or ethnic minorities. Like our experiences walking through the world are very different. And that's not good and that's not bad. That's just kind of is the reality. And how do we like make space for a shared understanding and for healing, considering those differences?
Well, Dr. Alsamadi, thank you so much for sharing that. And thinking about the conversation to overcome and challenge white supremacy and these binary ideas and constructs. For you, what does it mean to be a queer Palestinian American psychologist?
Well, I think one of the first things that comes to mind is just really like the value of like community and taking care of others and really wanting to be part of the collective. And education is really important to me. So like being a lifelong learner, being an educator and being in that environment, these are all things that I think that I learned from my parents. My dad is Palestinian, my mom is Italian, both being immigrants coming to this country. Like my family like is extremely close knit, like my parents and my sisters, like our community taking care of each other, like we would drop anything for our family. And so I think those things are really important to like me as a person, being that type of person in my professional and personal relationships and working with clients. And I think also like that relational piece, engaging with folks, being honest, being able to show up and talk about hard things, being able to expand beyond the binary, I think is really important, and making space for folks to feel witnessed, safe, and understood in their experiences.
And how can we support you?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to, I have to say, advocate for a ceasefire in Palestine. That is my, I think, number one thing. Just end the violence for Palestinians in Palestine right now and advocate for a ceasefire. Keep talking about what's happening and keep talking about what's happening worldwide. There are so many injustices and there's so much violence kind of happening that we don't get to hear about. And so just making sure that we are staying informed and learning from the folks who are experiencing these things firsthand. And then I think there's, like I mentioned earlier, a big gap in our field in discussing the issues that affect Arab and Swana communities. So continuing to learn about our communities, engaging with your podcast, I think is a really wonderful way to learn more about different types of people. Advocate for and really challenge yourselves to expand beyond the binary, to expand beyond these very limited definitions that we are given, and understand queerness in a much broader and expansive way.
So when we want to expand queerness in a broader way in an effort to challenge the binary, what would that look like? And more importantly, what would that look like within ourselves?
I would start to notice the assumptions that you make about folks' sexual and gender identities. One of the easiest ways to tune into this is to pay attention to when you're feeling surprised. This usually signals that one of your assumptions of how something, quote unquote, should be was violated. And based on these assumptions, you can think about what are the prototypes that you hold of what a cisgender man, a trans woman, a gay person, a non-binary person should look like, or how they should act. And ask yourself, how did these prototypes develop? And where did you learn these constructs? How do race and other identities show up in your vision of what a person is supposed to look like, how they're supposed to dress, how they're supposed to behave? And finally, consider how these assumptions are likely limiting both yours and your clients' experiences with exploring their gender and their sexuality and just their humanness in general.
Now, during the recording of this episode, we continue to see the ongoing genocide inflicted upon Palestinians in Gaza, students protesting for Palestinian freedom, and how these important issues are also affecting the profession of counseling and psychology. So during our conversation, I asked Dr. Alsamadi, a Palestinian American psychologist, what it was like for her to see these events and silencing unfold.
The most glaringly painful example of this erasure is the silence from our field as we witness almost 8 months of genocide of Palestinians in Gaza and the escalation of military and settler violence in the West Bank. It's been devastating to see not only the lack of response, but the denial of the atrocities that Palestinians in Gaza have been live streaming for the world to see. Our professional organizations and academic institutions claim social justice as an ethical imperative and an actionable value, yet punish those who demand divestment from war and genocide. That being said, I have also witnessed the power of community and the collective, and that there are amazing psychologists and students who are fighting for Palestinian freedom and understand that the liberation of all oppressed people is interconnected.
Well, Dr. Alsamadi, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I really appreciate the space to get to talk about these topics. I think it's really important. And I just love connecting with other people. So if anyone is listening to this and has questions or wants to talk more, I really encourage folks to reach out, because I would love to connect and continue to have these conversations.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. It really has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please share and subscribe to People of Color in Psychology. You can also support us by registering for continuing education courses or making a one-time donation on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. Your feedback is important to us, so feel free to send an email, a message on LinkedIn, or leave a voice message on our website. Until next time, this is your host, Jack Sutton.